Hello and welcome to the digital session at Cape Town Conversation 2025. The topic for this session is critical minerals, a turning point for the global south. I am Parul Bakshi, fellow climate and energy at Observer Research Foundation Middle East. And as we're in the middle of supply chain de-risking and decoupling, something that has been often talked about, specifically in perspective of the continent that we're sitting in right now, which is the African continent, I would like to bring into perspective the conversations around this topic. And joining me for that, we have two experts from different parts of the world. We have with us Veda Vidyanathan, fellow Center for Social and Economic Progress, India, and we have Kekili Ahiable, who's with the Tony Blair Institution as Advisor Trade and Infrastructure from the United Kingdom. Thank you so much for joining us today. And without much further ado, let us start with one of the most pressing issues and probably a difficult question to answer, but to set the context, how do we transform the existing ecosystem, which seems to be based more on an extraction-led perspective, to a more social, sustainable, and a more holistic value chain for the global south, which seems to be the hub for majority of these critical minerals that we use, from our smartphones to electric vehicles. I think no modern technology is complete without these critical minerals. So Veda, if I may, ask you to begin with your research and background on the African continent as well as India. What is your take on that?
Thank you, Parul. First of all, thank you for having us, and to the ORF as well. It's been wonderful being part of this dialogue. So yeah, for some quick context, so at CSEP in the last 2 years, we've been especially examining how India, with partner countries in Africa, can cooperate on critical minerals. And the big meta question that goes across our research is how do we balance this economic security issues that you presented with the developmental priorities? And I think one of the big things one of the big takeaways for me is that talking to more ministers and officials and stakeholders in mineral-rich countries, the big thing is that we need to reframe the role of these producer countries. We need to talk about leveraging the energy transition as a developmental window. And this means that from raw material providers, these countries actively become participants in building a resilient and sustainable global supply chain. And second is questions of sustainability and social licenses are often termed as, disadvantages, but we really need to start thinking of them as economic assets. Because if you start talking about ESG standards, community participation, responsible mining, all of these things actually increase competitiveness in the market. And how do we start thinking about these issues a little differently? The third is also one of the threads that's been common across our research is the importance of enhancing state capacity. So for instance, I was in a high-level policy dialogue in Lusaka recently, and one thing that kept coming up is how producer countries don't actually know the amount of reserves that they have. So how do we invest in geological mapping? How do we invest in building a critical mineral workforce? How do we improve contract negotiation for governments who are negotiating with foreign partners? And all of this will lead to the other big conversation that's happening, which is how do we use all of these resources to pursue a mineral-led industrialization? And a big key part of this is attracting investments. So how do we get blended finance? How do we get sovereign wealth funds and global partners to come and invest in helping build these value chains? And how do we then create, this fragmented policy landscape? How do we try and streamline a lot of those things? And finally, and I think the big point is, how do we move from what we've known as a pit to port model to a process and build model? Mm-hmm. And I think in that conversation, there's a lot of space for the global north actors to work, which is essentially the consumer countries, mm-hmm. to work alongside producer countries, and also other powers who are kind of in between. If you look at IPSA plus Indonesia, all of these countries are producer countries, also consumer countries in different parts of the value chain. How can we all try and build and contribute to building this ecosystem? I don't know if that answers your question.
No, absolutely. I think bringing you in, with your experience in trade, and I think Veda briefly mentioned about the investment aspect, the industrial policy, what has your experience been with Global South? And I think she was also referring to Global North playing a role in this. And, I think you're in a unique position where you're representing an institution that is based out of the UK, but you also do a lot of work within the African continent. So what has that experience been for you?
First, what I would want to say is a lot a lot can be said about, what needs to be done strategy-wise, policy-wise, implementation. But at the end of the day, I think what's going to really change or move the dial in these conversations is it's leadership. It's bold, visionary leadership. When we're talking African countries here, where historically the systems have been set to enable extraction. The railways are built leading out to the coastal to the coast, right? From the hinterlands into the coast, the ports, the infrastructure is built that way, and it's incredibly difficult to change something that has historically been. It's just almost set against countries, right? And so for change to happen, there needs to be bold leadership, political leadership. And I think we're actually seeing a wave of that across the continent. More needs to be done, but we're seeing some. I can quickly mention like the Sahel countries where, unfortunately, there have been a wave of juntas we've seen in the past years. But it's also a symptom of citizens crying out for, we want better, we want more, we want change, we want transformation, and we need it to be radical. Right. And what has actually happened in these countries is several of them. So like in Burkina Faso, in Mali, for instance, you've seen the states kind of taking a bit more control over their mineral infrastructure and their processing capacities and saying, hey, we're not going to be exporting raw materials. And then it goes into policy, right? This is going forward. This is what we're deciding as a country or as a region. We're not going to be taking our raw materials out in pretty much in the unrefined state. We're going to be processing in country. So that's one, and that's an example of what bold leadership can do. And in a few years, where the world is watching and waiting to see what's going to be coming out of those countries, and we can similar things can happen in Southern Africa as well, right? And we're beginning to see them. So I just want to add that on, and then. Maybe also talk about, so maybe take the example of, say, Southern Africa, where, and we're talking critical minerals here. We know Southern Africa is so rich in critical minerals. DRC has a lot of cobalt, which is needed for the production of like batteries, which we need for the e-vehicles and all of that. Mozambique has a lot of graphite. Zimbabwe has a lot of lithium, but processing capacity is so low right now, but processing capacity is low. We need to get that better, right? Again, using the Sahel examples. And what's needed is to bring the different country strategies together. Usually you have national laws that are, they're siloed. And what we've seen, and even looking at the EU, looking at the ASEAN, you do it better when you do it together. And so I think what's needed, again, taking lessons from, I guess if I could call it the West, and so the UK, the EU, they do it together. They trade better, over 60% trade, intra-regional trade in the EU, right? While Africa is struggling around 17%, right? So synchronizing strategies, policies, and then implementing and creating less friction across borders so that trade can move better and faster, and the processing can actually happen.
Absolutely agree with you. I think specifically the role of leadership at this point has been pivotal, given the fact that we are looking at instances of weaponization of access. So I think we're at a critical juncture when we talk about that. And also I think it feeds into a very important aspect, which is what I would like to discuss next, which is that, so you can have a bold leadership. And as you said, there are certain objectives that the leadership might have, but the process or the framework required in order to achieve those goals goes through policy, investment, technology, and oftentimes, of course, a more united stance, be it in the way of the African Union. The Global South has coordinated itself via BRICS, via multiple multiple other G20. We are having this conversation right in the backdrop of the conclusion of the recent G20, which also happened in South Africa. So there are, but at the same time, there are also national priorities that come into the picture, and specifically the role of finance that plays a role. So how do we bring in those frameworks within the global South in such a way that it enables a more smoother transition towards our broader objective, Veda?
So we have like 55 minutes to unpack all of us. So it's fine.
It's an ongoing conversation.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so much, right? Because I mean, the big question is, what does the global South even mean? I mean, I'm also already like really cautious about talking about Africa, right? Because it's so different when you talk about South Africa to Morocco and so on. But I think she really hit the nail on the head, because the big issue when it comes to global South economies and producer countries, right, is this policy unpredictability. It's the big reason that investors say it's a high-risk region, I don't know. And second, the markets are so fragmented. And again, she pointed this out. One big solution is to see, okay, how can we get these smaller countries to leverage strengths? What are the comparative advantages? Mapping that, first of all. And then sort of seeing how can we build these complementary ecosystems where, I don't know, because all of these things need energy, they need capital, they need infrastructure. So these aren't, at this point, blue sky thinking. We have, like, for instance, the DRC, Zambia Battery Alliance. I mean, I don't really know the development that's happened in that space, to be honest, because the things that I'm hearing today are things that I've been hearing for the last year and a half. But at least that framework of thinking exists, right? You have models where global North partners are working with countries that have formed clusters and saying, hang on, we can bring this, you bring this, and we can work together. So these platforms already exist. But I think, like she said, again, the big question really is, even if we have access to these resources and we have all of this extraction in place, what happens once you have it? Like, where do you process this, right? And I think that's where a lot of the conversation and a lot of the emphasis is on. And again, that's where, technology partnerships with the global North become important. That's where joint research and development become important. And actually, this is one of the things that's come up in our research. For instance, when we interviewed scientists in universities in South Africa and the National Metallurgical Laboratories in India, like NML in Jamshedpur, we figured that these scientists are asking very similar questions, right? But the problem is they don't really have visibility into each other's ecosystems. So how do we create platforms where knowledge can be shared? How do we create repositories of data, right? The Geological Survey of India, for instance, is for the first time going international to Zambia, where we've been given 9,000 kilometers of land to map copper in Zambia. So it's the first time that Indian geologists are going to work alongside Zambian geologists to map copper. So there are niche areas. The IIT Madras in India, which is a premier technical organization, university, has just started a campus in Zanzibar. Right? Think about it. IIT Madras decides to go global and they go to Zanzibar, right? To a country where we have a history of very rich developmental partnerships. So to this national priority of Tanzania and the larger AU priority of upskilling a workforce, how can Indian technical universities actually help fill some of the knowledge gaps? So I think the question, when you ask it like that, seems like huge and like, oh my God, how do we even begin? But the minute we start unpacking it and saying, okay, hang on, we have some comparative strengths here, maybe we can do this and that, then we're actually talking about meaningful, sustainable, collaborative ideas. Yeah.
Katie, same for you. There are different aspects, different progress that has already been made. So is there any aspect that you think is movement in the right direction, or even a successful model that you think that exists across the global South, which needn't be replicated, but can be a lesson? So we spoke about lessons from the West, which of course is there, but as we were talking about, even within the global South, a lot of ground has already been covered, or the direction, is there and has been there as part of the conversation for a while. So anything that you would like to highlight on that?
Yes. So I'd mention, processing isn't good. We've talked a lot about the need to process. Again, we're moving it away from just extractive to how can we create sustainable value on the continent or in global South countries. And processing is not going to happen if you don't have affordable, reliable power. And so that's such a critical part of the conversation. And so even just pointing to South Africa's G20 presidency, is it presidency, which has just concluded, where such a strong highlight on the need to create regional power pools has been made. I would underscore that even more. And so even in Southern Africa, again, we talk about how rich the region is in critical minerals. The Grand Inga Dam project has been in the works for, I think, more than 10 years now. We need to get beyond the... It needs to get the pace. It needs to move faster beyond, just talking about it, the challenges, all of that, to actually making it work. Because when you look at the numbers, that would be hugely transformational for Southern Africa. And then in West Africa, we have the West Africa Power Pool. Again, the studies, there's no jury out. It's clear that if you get these power pools to work, you can create that affordable, reliable access to power that Africa is lacking. And that's what's needed for processing capacity. If you don't have, if that doesn't happen, there's no way you're developing beyond the current extractive model. So I would just add that on as one.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we are running short of time. So Veda, just maybe a concluding remark from your end. What would you advise the broader Global South at Ankekli if later you would like to join on that one line? Yes, please go ahead.
Maybe not advice, but a concluding thought perhaps is that, one of the big decisive shifts, and I think this has been a pattern of conversation here, right? A thread of conversation across this conference is one of the big global shifts is how governments now, at least I think in the 2020s, are talking about industrial policies, climate policies, development priorities, and there's a convergence of all of these things, right? So we are at an era where problems are not siloed anymore. These are not economic opportunities or developmental problems. They're all enmeshed, which then means a couple of things. For governments, it means they'll need to start thinking about inter-ministerial coordination at a scale and speed they haven't seen before. For researchers like us, what that means is that to start thinking of systems and problems in a very different way than what we're used to. And I think the most important thing is, as people from the Global South, we don't really need to keep reinventing the wheel. Like she said, we're asking very similar questions across the oceans, right? So how do we find ways where we can actually pool our expertise and try and understand these very complex problems, complex global problems, how they relate in very local contexts? And I think that's going to be the big challenge for us. And I think that's also the exciting part, right? New era of problem solving. So thank you. And thank you so much for having us. It's been a pleasure.
What I'll just add on, I'll end how I started. We know the strategies, we know the policies, we know what needs to be done. We just need to get it done. Right. And it's going to take that bold, visionary leadership that's ready to take a risk, because in our contest, it's a risk to say, I'm stepping forward as the president of a country and I'm deciding this is the direction we're taking. We've seen it in countries like Singapore, right? No natural minerals, but look at where Singapore is today. If you want to get to a Singapore in the next 20 years, a China in the next 20 years, bold leadership, decisive action, that's needed. And so I'll just end with that. We need more of that.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us. And I think the key takeaway has been to continue the conversation on this topic. A lot has already been done, and hopefully the conversations continue turning into real world changes that we are hoping for. Thank you and stay tuned.